At 5:26 in the morning, the living room still held the visit. A pair of shoes sat near the door, a throw blanket had slipped halfway off the couch, and the coffee table carried the small evidence no one would photograph: 2 cups, a folded bill, a pair of reading glasses, and a faded recipe card softened at the corners. The coffee was still too hot to drink. You had paid the bills before anyone woke, the numbers leaving their quiet pressure behind your eyes. From another room, there was the ordinary sound of a parent moving through a morning routine: cabinet hinge, running water, one drawer opening and closing with a familiar care. Nothing needed to be fixed yet. 1 cup was moved from the table to the kitchen counter, and the recipe card stayed where it was, quiet as something understood, laid and held gently at last. The holiday morning did not feel like a holiday yet. It felt like the room after people had tried to be cheerful for a long time. Not in a false way. Not even in a bad way. Just in the way family can fill a house with voices, old stories, half-finished sentences, little corrections, laughter that gets too loud, and silences that arrive a second before anyone is ready for them. Now the living room was quiet. The bags near the door had not been carried out yet. One zipper was open, showing a sweatshirt sleeve and the corner of a paperback someone had meant to read. A pair of sneakers had been pushed close to the wall, but not neatly. A coat was folded over the arm of the couch in a shape that still looked tired. The coffee table held what the morning had left behind. A cup with a little dark coffee cooling at the bottom. A napkin folded twice. A grocery receipt from the day before. The faded recipe card, resting near the edge of the table, as if someone had set it down while remembering something and then been called into another room. It was not a beautiful part of the room. No one took pictures from this angle. Not the coffee table with its smudges. Not the corner where the carpet had flattened under years of feet. Not the lamp with dust along the shade, or the stack of mail tucked halfway under a magazine. This was the part of a house that kept living after the nice moments had passed. The real part. You sat there after paying the bills, with the laptop closed but still warm. The numbers were no longer on the screen, but they had not really left. They stayed in the body for a while, behind the eyes, along the shoulders, somewhere in the hand that had clicked from one account to another while the house slept. There were teenagers upstairs, or down the hall, or stretched across their own rooms in that deep morning sleep that makes the house feel younger than it is. Their doors were closed. Their shoes were somewhere they did not belong. Their chargers were probably still plugged into walls with no phones attached. You knew their rhythms. The late night footsteps. The half answers. The cereal bowl left in the sink. The sudden softness when they were too tired to guard themselves. The way they could seem almost grown in 1 hour and still impossibly young in the next. And behind all of that, from another room, came your parents' ordinary routine. A cabinet opened. Water ran for a few seconds. Something small touched the counter. The sound was so familiar that it almost disappeared. It had been there in one form or another for years, maybe your whole life. Someone rising early. Someone making coffee. Someone checking what needed to be taken out, wiped down, warmed up, put away. A person moving through care without naming it care. When you were younger, that sound was simply background. It meant morning. It meant the house was awake. It meant there would be something on the stove, or a light on in the kitchen, or a voice saying something ordinary from down the hall. It did not ask to be understood then. Most care does not. It just keeps moving. Now, sitting in the living room with the bills paid and the visit still hanging quietly in the air, the sound reached you differently. Not dramatically. Nothing opened all at once. There was no big ache, no sudden speech forming in your mouth. Just a small shift, like the room had changed temperature by 1 degree. The faded recipe card sat in front of you. You could see the old handwriting, the places where the ink had thinned, the faint stain near one corner. It was only paper. Still, it carried a kind of proof. Someone had made this thing enough times to keep the instructions. Someone had fed people from it. Someone had stood in a kitchen on mornings and evenings no one recorded. There was a weight after a family visit that was hard to explain. It was not only sadness. It was not only love. It was not even regret, though regret sometimes leaned against the doorway. It was the weight of seeing everyone more clearly and not knowing what to do with that seeing. The old habits were still there. The small comments. The way people misunderstood one another and kept moving anyway. The way everyone returned to their place in the family, even after years of trying to become someone else. A holiday could bring tenderness close, but it could also bring back the old shape of things. So the room held both. The warmth of people having been there. The relief of quiet after they left. The tiredness of carrying your own household while still feeling like someone's child when a familiar drawer opened in the next room. You reached for one cup on the coffee table. Only one. There were other things that could have been picked up. The receipt. The napkin. The mail. The recipe card. The whole room could have become a task if you let it. But your hand closed around the cup, and that was enough for that moment. The ceramic was still slightly warm. You carried it to the kitchen counter and set it down beside the sink. The parent in the other room kept moving through the morning. Maybe they did not know you had heard them. Maybe they had never known how much of their life had become part of your inner weather. You stood there for a second. The coffee was still too hot. The house was not fixed. The day had not begun gently enough to be called peaceful. But somewhere inside the ordinary sound of water, paper, ceramic, and a parent moving through another room, gratitude arrived without asking to be announced. Late, maybe. But real. By the time the first pale light reached the living room windows, the house had settled into the kind of quiet that comes after too much closeness. Not distance. Just quiet. The visit had asked something from everyone. It had asked people to remember who they used to be, and who they were expected to be, and who they had become when no one was looking. It had asked the teenagers to come out of their rooms, to answer questions from relatives, to stand still for hugs they were almost too old for and not quite old enough to refuse. It had asked you to keep track of everything. Who needed coffee? Who had eaten? Who was tired? Which bill still had to be paid before the morning got away from you? Which comment could be ignored, and which one would sit under the skin for a while? Which teenager needed a little space? Which parent was moving slower than last year, though no one said it? A family visit can leave the room full, even after the people have gone quiet. The couch still held the shape of someone who had sat there with one ankle crossed over the other. A blanket was tucked into the crease between cushions. The remote had disappeared under a magazine. The coffee table looked less like furniture and more like a small map of what had happened. Cups, paper, crumbs, a pen, a folded bill, and the faded recipe card. It was still there. Its corners had softened from being handled. The handwriting leaned slightly to one side. Maybe it belonged to your parent. Maybe to someone before them. Maybe it had been copied from another card, another kitchen, another holiday morning when someone was trying to make enough food for everyone and still keep the house steady. The card did not explain anything. It simply stayed. There was something about that which made the room easier to sit in. The card had no opinion about the visit. It did not ask whether everyone had been kind enough. It did not ask whether you had done enough, listened enough, cleaned enough, kept your voice soft enough. It held flour, sugar, oven temperature, time. Small facts. And sometimes small facts are easier to hold than feelings. From the next room, your parents' routine continued in pieces. A faucet turned on. A cabinet closed. A spoon touched the side of a mug. These were not grand sounds. They were not the sounds people remember on purpose. But they were the sounds that had held entire years together. You had lived beside them before you knew they were care. Before you understood that someone had to notice the empty milk, the school forms, the coats by the door, the birthdays coming up, the bills due, the dishes no one wanted to do, the quiet moods around the table. Back then, it had all seemed to happen. By the time the first pale light reached the living room windows, the house had settled into the kind of quiet that comes after too much closeness. Not distance. Just quiet. The visit had asked something from everyone. It had asked people to remember who they used to be, and who they were expected to be, and who they had become when no one was looking. It had asked the teenagers to come out of their rooms, to answer questions from relatives, to stand still for hugs they were almost too old for and not quite old enough to refuse. It had asked you to keep track of everything. Who needed coffee? Who had eaten? Who was tired? Which bill still had to be paid before the morning got away from you? Which comment could be ignored, and which one would sit under the skin for a while? Which teenager needed a little space? Which parent was moving slower than last year, though no one said it? A family visit can leave the room full, even after the people have gone quiet. The couch still held the shape of someone who had sat there with one ankle crossed over the other. A blanket was tucked into the crease between cushions. The remote had disappeared under a magazine. The coffee table looked less like furniture and more like a small map of what had happened. Cups, paper, crumbs, a pen, a folded bill, and the faded recipe card. It was still there. Its corners had softened from being handled. The handwriting leaned slightly to one side. Maybe it belonged to your parent. Maybe to someone before them. Maybe it had been copied from another card, Another kitchen, another holiday morning when someone was trying to make enough food for everyone and still keep the house steady. The card did not explain anything. It simply stayed. There was something about that which made the room easier to sit in. The card had no opinion about the visit. It did not ask whether everyone had been kind enough. It did not ask whether you had done enough, listened enough, cleaned enough, kept your voice soft enough. It held flour, sugar, oven temperature, time. Small facts. And sometimes small facts are easier to hold than feelings. From the next room, your parents' routine continued in pieces. A faucet turned on. A cabinet closed. A spoon touched the side of a mug. These were not grand sounds. They were not the sounds people remember on purpose. But they were the sounds that had held entire years together. You had lived beside them before you knew they were care. Before you understood that someone had to notice the empty milk, the school forms, the coats by the door, the birthdays coming up, the bills due, the dishes no one wanted to do, the quiet moods around the table. Back then, it had all seemed to happen. There was a kind of quiet that did not mean empty. It sat in the living room with all the leftover things. It stayed in the small crease of the couch cushion, in the cool place on the coffee table where a cup had been lifted, in the soft fold of the blanket no one had put back. The room had not been restored to itself yet, but it was no longer full of voices. That in-between feeling had its own weight. After a family visit, the silence can arrive slowly. Not as peace all at once, but as the last small sounds leaving one by one. A car door outside. A zipper pulled shut. Someone calling back from the front steps. The house holding itself still after being asked to hold so much. Now there was only morning. The faded recipe card stayed near the center of the coffee table. In the dim light, it looked almost like any other piece of paper. Something that could be swept into a pile without thinking. Something that could disappear under mail or a magazine or a teenager's hoodie. But you kept noticing it. Maybe because it belonged to another kind of keeping. Not the bills paid online. Not the calendar alerts. Not the messages waiting on the phone. The card came from a slower world, one where someone wrote things down because they expected to make them again. For the next birthday. The next holiday. The next time people came home hungry and a little difficult and still loved. The handwriting did not look careful anymore. It looked used. Some letters had faded at the edges. A small stain covered part of one word, but not enough to lose it. The corner had been bent and flattened more than once. Someone's thumb had probably rested there while measuring, stirring, answering a question from across the kitchen. That was the part that stayed with you. Not the recipe itself. The thumb. The hand. The person standing there while everyone else moved around them, asking where the serving spoon was, whether the rolls were done, whether anyone had seen the good dish towel. A person doing one thing while already listening for the next thing. A person whose attention had been divided so often it began to look like calm. From the other room, your parent cleared their throat softly. Then came the sound of a drawer. It was such a small sound. Wood against wood, or metal sliding along a track. Nothing anyone would stop to name. But in the stillness of the morning, it traveled through the room and touched something older than thought. You had heard that sound as a child. You had heard it before school, before long drives, before holidays, before ordinary Tuesdays that seemed to have no meaning at the time. It had lived behind your own growing up, as steady as the refrigerator hum or the first light under the kitchen door. Back then, you did not know that adults could be tired in the morning before the day even began. You did not know a person could stand at a counter, making breakfast, while already counting money in their head. You did not know someone could answer kindly while carrying a private worry. You did not know love often sounded like opening the same drawer again and again. Now you knew. Not perfectly. Just more. And knowing more did not make you feel higher than the past. It made you feel quieter inside it. It made the room less simple. It made the faded card less like a thing and more like a small door left open. You sat back down on the couch. The coffee on the table had cooled enough to drink, but you did not reach for it yet. Your hand rested near the folded bill. The paper was ordinary, sharp-edged, current. The recipe card beside it was soft, old, almost tender. One belonged to what had to be handled now. One belonged to what had been handled before you understood handling. The two papers stayed there together. For a moment, nothing asked to be sorted. The teenagers slept somewhere beyond the hallway. Your parent moved in the background. The living room held the evidence of everyone passing through it. And you sat in the part of the room no one would photograph, feeling the strange mercy of not needing to make the morning look better than it was. Understanding had come late. Still, it had come, There was a way the morning seemed to protect what had not been said. The house did not ask anyone to explain the night before. It did not ask why one conversation had become quiet around the edges, or why one laugh had sounded almost too bright, or why certain names still changed the air when they were spoken. It simply held the couch, the coffee table, the bags by the door, the faint smell of coffee, the folded bill, the faded recipe card. That was enough for now. You could feel the old family shape still nearby. Not as something dramatic. More like furniture you had learned to walk around in the dark. The places where someone might take offense. The places where someone might pretend not to. The small effort of keeping your own voice even when another voice came from a much older room inside you. A family visit can make a grown person feel split in two. One part is the parent of teenagers, paying bills before dawn, checking the month ahead, knowing which light switch sticks and which outlet needs replacing. The other part is still someone's child, hearing a parent move in the background, feeling the old pull of wanting to be understood without asking too much. Both parts sat in the same living room. One noticed the practical things. The cup to move. The bill to file. The bags that would need to be carried. The teenagers who would wake hungry and quiet, then loud, then quiet again. The food that might be reheated. The text messages that would arrive later from relatives already on the road. The other part kept listening. A faucet. A drawer. A cabinet door closing with care. The sounds were ordinary, but they had roots. They reached back into mornings when you were not the one holding the household together. When someone else knew the bills, the moods, the schedule, the weather, the missing glove, the favorite cereal, the tired look on a child's face before the child knew how to call it tired. You did not understand it then. Maybe no one does at the time. The faded recipe card seemed to belong to that old kind of noticing. It did not make a speech about love. It did not need the family to become easier than it was. It simply carried the marks of being used, the softened edge, the pale stain, the handwritten line that had survived years of kitchens and drawers and holiday mornings. Someone had kept it. Someone had thought it was worth saving after the meal was over. After plates were scraped, after chairs were pushed in, after people left with leftovers in plastic containers and said they would call when they got home. The card remained. Not because it was perfect, but because it belonged to the way people tried. That word stayed quietly. Tried. People tried in uneven ways. A parent tried by waking early. A teenager tried by coming downstairs even when they did not know what to say. You tried by paying the bill before sunrise, by moving one cup instead of resenting the whole table, by letting the room stay messy while your body caught up with itself. No one's trying looked complete. It rarely does inside a family. There were moments from the visit you might think about later. A sentence you wished had landed differently. A look across the room. A small kindness almost missed because it arrived between louder things. Someone taking a plate to the sink. Someone leaving the last piece of pie for another person. Someone touching the back of a chair before walking away. Family is often carried in pieces too small to defend. The coffee had cooled now. You lifted it and took one careful sip. It was still warmer than expected, bitter in the quiet way morning coffee can be when it has waited too long. The cup made a soft sound when you set it back down. From the other room, your parents' steps crossed the floor. You did not call out. Not yet. The room felt tender enough without words. The recipe card stayed on the table, and the bill stayed beside it, and the first light widened a little across the carpet. Somewhere in the house, a teenager shifted in sleep. Somewhere close by, a parent kept moving through the morning as if care were simply what the hands did next. For a while, you let that be the place where the weight could sit. Not solved. Just held. By the time the house became fully quiet again, morning had begun to feel less like a beginning and more like a place to rest for a while. The light was still low. It did not fill the room. It only touched the edges of things. The corner of the coffee table. The side of the cup. The faded recipe card with its old handwriting. The folded bill, still there, no longer as sharp in the softening light. A blanket across the couch. A bag by the door, waiting for someone to remember it. Nothing had moved much. And somehow that helped. There are mornings when the kindest thing is not a clean room, or a finished list, or the feeling that the day has been taken back under control. Sometimes the kindest thing is a room that tells the truth without making too much noise. This room did that. It showed the visit. It showed the cost of being together. It showed the effort of meals and bills and teenagers and old family rhythms. It showed the strange tenderness of people leaving traces behind, a cup ring, a bent napkin, a sweater sleeve, the recipe card that had traveled through more years than anyone mentioned. The card stayed in the center of your attention. Not because it was important in any official way. It was not framed. It was not protected. It had probably spent years in drawers with rubber bands, takeout menus, birthday candles, pens that no longer worked, and other things a household keeps because no one quite knows how to throw them away. But this morning, it seemed to hold a whole room inside it. A kitchen somewhere in the past. A parent's hand. The soft pressure of a thumb near the corner. Someone reading the same line twice while people talked around them. Someone measuring, waiting, stirring, answering, cleaning, remembering, forgetting, trying again. The old card did not make the past gentle. It only made the care visible. That was different. The past could still have its hard edges. The visit could still have its tired places. A person could still love their family and need silence afterward. A person could still feel grateful and worn down in the same breath. The heart does not always separate things neatly before morning comes. It carries them together. From the background, your parents' routine had grown quieter. Maybe they had sat down. Maybe they were standing at the counter with both hands around a mug, looking toward a window without really seeing outside. Maybe they were tired too, in a way they would never announce. You thought of all the mornings they must have stood like that. Mornings when you were small. Mornings when money was tight. Mornings before work, before school, before holidays, before ordinary days that would disappear almost completely from memory. They had moved through them anyway, not as heroes, not as saints, just as people who had something to take care of. That thought did not ask anything from you. It only sat down beside you. The teenagers were still asleep. Their rooms held their own small storms, clothes on chairs, phones charging, homework half finished, cups that should have been brought downstairs. Later, the house would become itself again. Someone would ask what there was to eat. Someone would be annoyed by a harmless question. Someone would leave a light on. The day would become practical. But not yet. For now, there was only the living room during a quiet holiday morning, the part of the room no one photographed, the coffee cooling, the parent in the background, the recipe card in front of you, and the wait after a family visit finally finding a place to sit. You reached toward the card, but did not pick it up. Your fingers only touched the edge. The paper felt thin. Almost fragile. Still here. And maybe that was enough for this moment. Not an answer. Not forgiveness shaped into words. Not a promise that the next visit would be easier, or that the old patterns would loosen, or that everyone would know how to love each other in a way that landed cleanly. Just the card. Just the room. Just one cup moved from the table earlier, and the rest of the day waiting without hurry. Gratitude arrived like that sometimes, after understanding had taken years to cross the room. It came late, carrying no speech with it. It rested near the old handwriting, near the bill, near the morning coffee, near the sound of someone still moving quietly because love had always had ordinary work to do. You sat there a little longer. The house breathed around you. Later, when the house began to wake, the room would change. A teenager would come down looking for something to eat. Someone would ask where a bag had gone. The bill would be moved to a safer place. The recipe card might be picked up and returned to a drawer, or left there a little longer in the morning light. But for now, it stayed. The coffee table held its quiet evidence. The cup ring. The folded paper. The softened corner of the card. The small part of the room no one thought to photograph, because it looked too ordinary to keep. From another room came one more familiar sound. A cabinet closing. A parent still moving gently through the day. And in that sound, there was no need to make the visit easier than it had been. The wait had found a place to sit. Understanding came late. Still, it came.